This is lecture 10 in Psych 4981, History of Psychology. In this lecture, we turn to some early 20th century developments that led to the professionalization of psychology. That is, psychology came to have an applied focus that accompanied the work that was going on in the laboratory. Today, you can still see this in your typical psychology department that not only awards research PhDs to new psychologists, but offers postgraduate programs in industrial organizational psychology, clinical, counseling, sport, forensic, business, and health psychology. Some of the people I cover in this lecture were the pioneers of fields like these. First person we have up today is probably the most colorful person in the history of psychology, at least in my book, and that's Hugo Munsterberg, seen sitting here at a table with a mustache, and his students and his assistants are posed around him in all sorts of silly ways. He was, for a time, a huge success in American psychology and was the psychologist best known to the public. He wrote hundreds of popular magazine articles and almost 24 books. He was a guest of 2 American presidents at the White House. He was highly sought as a consultant by business and government leaders and knew many rich and famous people, including Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm, the steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, and many movie stars and intellectuals. He was a professor at Harvard University, and he was elected to the presidency of the American Psychological Association and the American Philosophical Association. He was a founder of applied psychology and made many contributions to other areas of psychology as well. But towards the end of his life, Münsterberg became the object of scorn and ridicule. Newspapers published cartoons of him as a caricature, an example that you can see here. Harvard was embarrassed to have him on its faculty. In fact, one Harvard alumnus offered the university $10 million to fire him. When he died in 1916, there were few eulogies for him. So what happened? Well, let's go back and look at his life a little bit. Hugo Munsterberg was born in 1863 in Danzig, Germany, and he lived there until he was 19 when he left to go to Leipzig, intending to study medicine. But after taking a course with Wilhelm Wundt, he changed his plans. He was excited about this new field of psychology, so he ended up receiving his PhD from Wundt in 1886 and earned an MD at the University of Heidelberg 2 years later. He then took a job as a private lecturer without salary in philosophy at the University of Freiburg. There, he taught courses on epistemology, ethics, the philosophy of the natural sciences, psychology, and education. And it was during this time that he got around to publishing his doctoral thesis as a book, titled On Voluntary Action, A Contribution to Physiological Psychology, in which he argued that our experience of exerting effort was entirely due to sensations coming from the muscles, tendons, and joints. That is, our body gave us feedback which influenced our mind. This was in direct disagreement with Wundt's teachings, but that didn't stop Münsterberg from doing more experiments on the topic. He got these papers published, and he was starting to have more and more of an impact on his German colleagues. One historian has argued that Münsterberg was largely responsible for the decline of Wundt's disciples because of these experiments. It's perhaps not such a surprise, then, that William James was impressed with him when they met in 1889. In his Principles of Psychology, in fact, James talked quite a lot about Münsterberg's research. So, in 1892, Münsterberg was invited to spend a 5-year sabbatical at Harvard and to direct the laboratory there. At Harvard, he was well received. James was looking forward to stepping away from psychology, and so Münsterberg just took control when he got there. In 1897, he took a permanent position at Harvard and was there until his death. James had changed his own title from professor of psychology to professor of philosophy, and Münsterberg therefore became the professor of psychology. In 1898, he was elected president of the American Psychological Association. In 1899, he published a popular book titled Psychology and Life. By 1905, he was a much sought-after person for speeches and giving advice to traveling dignitaries and intellectuals. He started to develop a significant program in applying psychology to real-world problems. Here I'm going to review 3 of those. Forensic psychology was the first applied area in which he worked. That is, psychology and the law. He wrote magazine articles on topics such as crime prevention, the use of hypnosis to question suspects, and mental tests to detect guilty people. And he even talked about the lack of trustworthiness of eyewitness testimony. He conducted research on simulated crimes in which witnesses were asked immediately after seeing the crime to describe what had occurred. The subjects could not agree on the details of what they had witnessed, though it was fresh in their memory. How accurate can such testimony be in the courtroom? Münsterberg asked, when even that under discussion would have been taking place months and months before. In 1908, he published a book called On the Witness Stand to talk about these problems with eyewitness testimony. This book also considered other psychological factors like jury decision-making, the use of polygraph tests, and other topics still of interest today. In fact, the book has been reprinted many times over the years. He also did work on clinical psychology. In 1909, he published a book called Psychotherapy. He treated patients in his laboratory rather than in a clinic, and he never charged a fee. Mental illness, he believed, was a problem of behavioral maladjustment, not something like deep unconscious conflicts like Freud believed in. He said, there is no subconscious. When Freud and Jung visited Clark University in 1909, Münsterberg left the country and returned only after they had gone back to Europe, thus avoiding a confrontation. His therapeutic approach was to force the patient's disturbing ideas out of awareness, to suppress the behaviors that were undesirable or troubling, and to urge the patient to forget the emotional difficulties they had. He treated a variety of problems, including alcoholism, drug abuse, hallucinations, obsessive thoughts, phobias, and sex disorders. For a time, he used hypnosis, but stopped after a woman patient threatened him with a gun. The story ended up making it into the newspapers, and Harvard's president demanded that Münsterberg refrain from hypnotizing women. His book did bring a lot of attention to the field of clinical psychology, but it was not well received by Leitner Whitmer over at the University of Pennsylvania. Whitmer complained that Münsterberg had cheapened the profession by hawking claims of cures in the marketplace. He called Münsterberg little better than a faith healer because of the jaunty way in which the professor at Harvard goes about the country, claiming to have treated in his psychology laboratory hundreds and hundreds of cases of this or that form of nervous disorder. And then the third topic that he promoted was industrial psychology. He was hired as a consultant by several companies, and for them, he performed a great deal of research, and he published his findings in Psychology and Industrial Efficiency in 1913, which was written for the general public. It made the bestseller list. In it, he argued the best way to increase job efficiency and employee productivity and satisfaction was to select workers for positions that matched their mental and emotional abilities. So he developed various psychological selection techniques, such as mental tests and job simulators, in which the applicants' knowledge skills and their abilities could be assessed. Here's an example of one such test that could be used to test the skills of applicants for a chauffeur job. Now, Münsterberg never shied from controversy. He was involved in all sorts of public debates. In 1908, he became involved in the fight over Prohibition. This was that movement in the United States to ban the sale of alcoholic beverages. He argued against Prohibition, citing his expertise as a psychologist, and he expressed the opinion that alcohol in moderation was beneficial. German-American brewers like Busch and Pabst liked his position, and they donated sizable contributions to Münsterberg's foundation to promote Germany's image in the United States. One of these was for $50,000, and it was given for Münsterberg's proposed Germanic Museum. But unfortunately, the timing was that it came just days after Münsterberg had written an article against Prohibition. The news media picked up on this, and it gave him a lot of grief. You might remember, too, that he was supportive of Mary Whiton Calkins and several other female graduate students, but ultimately he believed that graduate work was too demanding for women. His view was that women should not be trained for careers because that would take them away from the home. He argued that women should not teach in public schools because they could not teach as well as men, and they were poor role models for boys. And he said that women should not be allowed to serve on juries because they were incapable of making rational decisions. This latter comment also drew a lot of media attention, and his comments ended up being published internationally in newspapers all over the world. The president of Harvard and most of his colleagues there did not like all these sensationalist stories, nor did they approve of him of applying psychology to practical problems. This was especially so after he, Münsterberg, started to give speeches in favor of Germany's position in World War I. War had broken out in Europe, but the U.S. did not become directly involved until 1917. During that time, though, American opinion was decidedly anti-German. Germany was considered the aggressor in a war that had already claimed millions of lives. And here was Münsterberg insisting on defending Germany, which was quite an unpopular position to take. So as a result of this, newspapers started reporting that Münsterberg was a German spy. The Boston newspaper called for his resignation. His neighbors in Cambridge, Massachusetts, suspected that the pigeons his daughter was seen feeding in the back of their house were actually being used to carry messages to other spies. And so I mentioned before, one Harvard alumnus offered the university $10 million to fire him. He started receiving death threats in the mail, and was snubbed by his colleagues. All this pressure broke his spirit. And then, on a cold winter's day, December 16th, 1916, he set off to teach his morning class on foot through deep snow. By the time he reached the lecture hall, he felt exhausted. He entered the classroom and lectured for about a half an hour before he fell to the floor mid-sentence and died instantly of a massive stroke. And as I said before, there weren't many eulogies for him when he died. He was terribly unpopular at this point, and it was more like a relief that he was gone than anybody celebrating his life. Next person I want to talk about is Walter Dill Scott. Scott was another student of Wundt. It's interesting that if you remember that Wundt was never in favor of applied psychology, yet Walter Dill Scott went on to apply the new science of psychology to advertising and business, much like the way Münsterberg ended up applying psychology. Scott was an American who was born in Illinois and became interested in psychology through a magazine article about Wundt and his laboratory. In 1898, he and his new wife moved to Leipzig, where he worked on his PhD, and his wife traveled 14 kilometers away to work on her PhD in literature at the University in Halle. They saw each other on the weekends. They returned home 2 years later, where Scott joined the faculty at Northwestern University as an instructor in psychology and pedagogy. In 1902, he was approached by an advertising executive for some advice about using psychology to make his ads more effective. Scott was intrigued by this idea, and he ended up writing The Theory and Practice of Advertising in 1903 and followed it with magazine articles and books. He argued that consumers were not rational beings and could be easily influenced. He focused on emotion and sympathy as important factors in heightening this suggestibility. He also believed that women were more easily influenced than men by advertisements that especially played on their emotions and sentimentality. Applying what he called the law of suggestibility to advertising, he recommended that companies use direct commands, such as use Pear's soap, to sell their products. He also promoted the use of return coupons because they required customers to take some direct action, tearing the coupon out of the magazine or newspaper, filling it in, and mailing it in to get a free sample. Both techniques, direct commands and coupon returns, were quickly adopted by advertisers and were in widespread use by 1910. When the U.S. entered World War I, Scott offered his skills to the Army to help select military personnel. He had developed these skills in research with companies. He had devised rating scales and group tests that would measure the characteristics shown by people who were already successful in those occupations. He would do this by first questioning Army officers and business managers, asking them to rank their subordinates on appearance, demeanor, sincerity, productivity, character, and value to the organization. And then job applicants could be ranked on those same qualities. And if you scored high enough on those, then you would be considered, a successful person for that particular position. Scott also developed intelligence tests, which were more focused on practical knowledge and abilities, such as judgment, quickness, and accuracy. So you can see already from Münsterberg and from Scott, we have this interest in psychology. And you also got to remember John Watson over at the Walter Thompson Advertising Agency. Psychology is starting to have a contribution to the business of America, that people are able to supposedly do better in their jobs, they're able to advertise better, and so on, because of this kind of research. The next person I want to tell you about made important contributions to applied psychology in a different area. She was focused more on management, how we could have a scientific approach to management of employees. And she was also interested in the interface between psychology and engineering. Her name was Lillian Gilbreth, who lived from 1878 to 1972. She was born in Oakland, California in 1878. She was the eldest of the family's 9 surviving children. She was educated at home until the age of 9, and then she began formal schooling in the first grade at a public elementary school, and she was rapidly promoted through the grade levels. She was elected vice president of her senior class at Oakland High School and graduated with exemplary grades in May 1896. Although Molar wanted to go to college, her father was opposed to such education for his daughters. This meant that she had not taken all the required university preparatory courses in high school. But she was able to persuade her father to let her try university for a year, and she was admitted to the University of California on the condition that she take a missing Latin course in her first semester. She was one of 300 entering students that year. The University of California at that time was housed in 4 buildings in the hills outside of the village of Berkeley. It charged no tuition for Californians, but it was also underfunded. Classes were large and many were held in tents. There were no student accommodations on campus. Men lived in nearby boarding schools, but the women commuted from their homes. Now, Molar did well enough during her first year, coming in near the top of her class, so her father agreed to her continuing her education. She commuted from home on the streetcar, and in the evenings helped her mother with the household and her siblings with the homework. She majored in English, studied philosophy and psychology, and had enough education courses to earn a teaching certificate. She also won a prize for poetry and acted in student plays. In the spring of her senior year, the new university president asked her to be one of the student speakers at the commencement ceremonies. So on May 16th, 1900, she graduated from the university and became the first woman to speak at a University of California commencement. The title of her speech was Life, a Means or an End. Gilbreth articulated her philosophy of life, which served as a foundation for her work through her entire career. She believed that all individuals have the right to happiness, and the goal of human life is the fulfillment and happiness of the person. She began her studies then for a PhD at the University of California, but took time off to travel in Europe in the spring of 1903. It was on that trip when she met her future husband, Frank Gilbreth. When they returned to the U.S., they married in 1904 and relocated to the East Coast. She completed her dissertation for her doctorate from the University of California in Berkeley in 1911, but in the end, it was not awarded due to her non-compliance with state residency requirements for doctoral candidates. That is because she had moved to the East Coast, she was no longer eligible to receive the PhD that she had just finished her dissertation for. She did end up publishing the dissertation in a book titled The Psychology of Management, the Function of the Mind in Determining, Teaching, and Installing Methods of Least Waste in 1914. After the Gilbreths moved to the East Coast, Lillian enrolled at Brown University, and there she earned a PhD in applied psychology. The topic of her dissertation there was the application of psychology and scientific management to the work of classroom teachers. It was titled Some Aspects of Eliminating Waste in Teaching, and she was awarded her PhD then, finally, in 1915. 3 days later, I'll add, she gave birth to her 7th child. For more than 40 years, Gilbreth's career combined psychology with the study of scientific management and engineering. She also included her perspectives as a wife and mother in her research, writing, and consulting work. Gilbreth became a pioneer in what is now known as industrial and organizational psychology. She helped industrial engineers recognize the importance of the psychological dimensions of work. In addition, she became the first American engineer ever to create a synthesis of psychology and scientific management. Gilbreth and her husband were equal partners in their engineering and management consulting firm of Gilbreth Incorporated. She continued to lead the company for decades after his death in 1924, largely using her home as her office. The Gilbreths were especially adept at performing time and motion studies. They named their methodology the Gilbreth system and used the slogan, "the one best way to do work," to promote it. The Gilbreths also developed a new technique for their studies that used a motion picture camera to record work processes. These filmed observations enabled the Gilbreths to redesign machinery to better suit workers' movements to improve efficiency and reduce fatigue. Their research on fatigue was a forerunner to the field of ergonomics. Their consulting business included implementing novel ideas at the time, such as an employee suggestion box, having rest periods at work, having process charts, and alternative work. They redesigned the jobs based on employees' perspectives, a new approach for this emerging discipline of industrial psychology. They developed ways to employ physically handicapped workers so they could become productive community members. And while they're doing all this, they also would teach free 2-week summer schools in scientific management from 1913 to 1916. And through it all, the Gilbreths became the parents of a large family that included 12 children. One died young in 1912, and 11 of them lived to adulthood. So here they are pictured. You can see them on the left, and the parents are in the middle, Frank and Lillian. And then they again are on the right. You can see Frank on the far left and Lillian's on the far right. But the tragic thing is that Frank died in 1924, leaving Lillian to raise still some young children there in a pretty large family. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but I thought I'd go ahead and show you some film of the Gilbreths, and this comes, actually most of this footage comes from their business that they had, and you can see how they're trying to study workers' movements to see how they can make them more efficient. Now, after Frank died, Lillian, had to earn additional income to support her large family. So she started delivering addresses to business and industry gatherings, as well as to college and university campuses such as Harvard, Yale, Colgate, the University of Michigan, MIT, Stanford, and Purdue. In 1925, she succeeded her husband as a visiting lecturer at Purdue University in Indiana, where he had been delivering annual lectures. In 1935, she became a professor of management at Purdue's School of Mechanical Engineering and the country's first female engineering professor. She was promoted to a full professor at Purdue in 1940. She divided her time between Purdue's departments of industrial engineering, industrial psychology, home economics, and the dean's office, where she consulted on careers for women. In cooperation with Marvin Mundell, she established and supervised a time and motion study laboratory at Purdue School. She also demonstrated how these time and motion studies could be used in agricultural studies, and later transferred these techniques to the home economics department under the banner of work simplification. She worked there until she retired from Purdue in 1948. During this time, she also consulted with lots of different companies, and she tried to extend the application of psychology to pull out problems in areas such as office machine companies, hospitals, and sports. For example, she worked for General Electric and other appliance manufacturing companies to assist in redesigning kitchen and household appliances. She worked with Johnson & Johnson on sanitary napkins and also helped that company and Macy's department store. As I said, she worked on the development of the kitchen. She also worked on a work desk that IBM adopted in 1933. And as I said, she was also teaching at this time at Purdue University and becoming a full professor in 1940. Two of her most notable inventions were the shelves inside refrigerator doors and the foot pedal trash can. She wrote 2 books in 1927 and 1928 that reflected her personal concerns about challenges faced by women in managing homes, raising families, and working in jobs outside the homes. And during the Great Depression and in World War II, she would help American presidents develop policies about the employment of women, and this continued all the way through the Korean War in the 1950s. After she retired from Purdue, she continued to travel and deliver lectures. In 1964, at the age of 86, she became the resident lecturer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In 1968, when her health finally began to fail, she retired from her active public life and eventually entered a nursing home. And she died in 1972 at the age of 94. Throughout her life, she was given many different honors. She had over 23 honorary degrees from various universities. She became the second woman to become a member of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. In 1965, she was elected to the National Academy of Engineering. In 1984, the United States released a postage stamp in her honor, one of the few psychologists who's had a postage stamp in the U.S. And finally, she became famous in another way, which was that her 2 adult children ended up writing a book about their family and how their mother had taken care of them with all of these kids in the family, and titled it Cheaper by the Dozen. Cheaper by the Dozen was then made into a movie in 1950, and then it was remade again in 2003, although if you watch the 2003 and later versions, there's very little resemblance to anything having to do with the Gilbreths here. In 1950, they were actually, the main characters were actually called Lillian and Frank. The children also wrote a sequel to the book, Cheaper by the Dozen, called Bells on Their Toes, that was published in 1950. So you can still find these books, these movies here that kind of tell you a little bit more about her. But the sad thing is that I have found that you find, when you look through a lot of history of psychology textbooks, even to today, there's still very little mention of Lillian Gilbreth. I don't know why that is. It's probably because a lot of historians of psychology don't cover applied topics. And some maybe considered her to be more of an engineer than she was a psychologist, but she did actually get her PhD in applied psychology, and she was an amazing person that made many important contributions. All right, I want to move on to a different topic now, and that is I want to turn to the subject of how clinical and counseling psychology developed in the 20th century. Now, the history I'm covering here largely is what occurred in the United States, but similar developments soon took hold in other countries. In the US, one of the things you can look at in the earliest 20th century was what was called the mental hygiene movement, and it was started by this fellow Clifford Beers. He was a former mental patient, and in 1908 he wrote an important book called The Mind That Found Itself, based on his own experiences as a patient. He visited William James and received his endorsement in the form of a letter, which was then used as part of the introduction to the first edition of this book. He also visited Adolf Meyer in 1907, then the country's leading psychiatrist, and interested him in his cause, and at Meyer's suggestion adopted the name of mental hygiene for what he proposed. In 1908, Beers founded the National Committee for Mental Hygiene in Connecticut. Henry Phipps, a philanthropist, had read Beers's book and endowed the Phipps Psychiatric Clinic at Johns Hopkins, the clinic that Meyer was to head. Adolf Meyer had come to America from Switzerland in 1893, and he eventually settled at Johns Hopkins in 1910. And was important in all this because he saw psychiatry as having something, a bigger role outside of just a mental hospital. He took a really broad-minded and sensible view of the factors that influenced psychological disturbance. Now you can tell from the name of this, the mental hygiene movement, that it was trying to promote good mental health as well as recognizing and trying to treat people who were suffering from mental difficulties. And so they formed something called the National Committee for Mental Hygiene. This eventually became the National Association for Mental Health, and it had a huge role in developing government agencies that would be concerned about mental health. So it took its role not only in the improvement of mental hospitals, but also the tasks of prevention at the level of the family and the community. There was an eventual falling out between Beers and Meyer, and a new director, Thomas Selman, lost interest in the mental hospital and sought to just broaden mental hygiene at the community level through a series of surveys that eventually led to the U.S. government keeping better statistics on the mentally ill. By 1930, the first International Congress on Mental Hygiene met with 3,000 officially registered guests. So this National Association for Mental Health, or the National Committee for Mental Hygiene, had a lot of initiatives. And one of the initiatives they took was this gave rise to what happened in the 20s and 30s in guidance and counseling psychology. One of the things that they established was something called a child guidance clinic. So to raise mentally healthy adults, the association thought it was natural that mental health workers give attention to the development of the child and to the meeting of childhood disturbances as they arose. So the first task that presented itself was the prevention of juvenile delinquency. The courts were not lenient on juvenile offenders in the early 1900s, and it was reported that one American judge sentenced 65 children to jail and 40 others to a chain gang in a single year. In response, the National Committee for Mental Hygiene set up a division with the goal of establishing child guidance clinics in many cities. The organization of these clinics was important for the subsequent development of clinical psychology. They had a fairly uniform pattern. A part-time psychiatrist was the director of the clinic. He would set the policies and conduct staff conferences at least once a week. The actual therapeutic interactions were carried on by a psychologist who worked with the child and by a psychiatric social worker who worked with a parent, usually the child's mother. This set up a team pattern that carried on with some adult clinics after World War II. The other thing that happened during this time was a rise in this profession of counseling in schools and universities. So this was, again, a direct result of the mental hygiene movement, and it had to do with guidance and counseling, not only for those in difficulty, but for all people who were involved in education. And it was they were interested in contributing to the individual person's life plan. So over the years, a distinction gradually developed between clinical psychology, which addressed the problems of mental and emotional difficulties. They were sort of on the boundary between psychology and psychiatry, and counseling psychology, which dealt in part with the difficulties encountered in the course of trying to succeed in school, and on the positive side, vocational guidance, acquiring appropriate skills in social participation and general preparation for life, which was more on the border between psychology and education. In fact, in the United States, where you usually find counseling psychology programs is in departments of education or colleges of education. So that's where often on a university campus, the clinical psychologist will be over in the psych department, and the counseling psychologist will be over in education. In Australia, it doesn't seem to have taken that same sort of distinction isn't as strong, although there is some overlap between education and psychology when you look at counseling psych. Now, anyway, these techniques between like clinical and counseling psychology were overlapping, and oftentimes their distinctions would be blurred. More simply put, to really understand this, the clinical psychologist grew out of what was learned in psychiatric hospitals, while the counseling and guidance psychologist grew out of what was learned to individualize education. So let's talk a little bit more about how clinical psychology was going then in the 20s and 30s, in this period before World War II. The main approach that sort of dominated the way clinical psychology was going on before the war were psychoanalytic psychotherapies. So these psychoanalytic followers of Sigmund Freud, they would make a distinction between what they called long-term psychoanalysis, which ordinarily required several hour-long sessions per week over 1 or more years, and psychoanalytic psychotherapy, which uses some of what has been learned in psychoanalysis for shorter treatments, perhaps 1 hour per week for as long as necessary. So when psychoanalysts themselves spoke of psychotherapy, they were referring to this shorter version. It was always rare for clinical psychologists in the United States to practice full-scale psychoanalysis, partly because of the medical orientation of the psychoanalytic training institutions there. Some of the well-known analysts have also been lay analysts, that is, they didn't have an MD degree, but few of those people were trained in the U.S. At least some of the recognized institutes affiliated with the American Psychiatric Association would allow them to be trained that way. Psychoanalytic theory and some derivatives were prominent in clinical psychology in these years before the war, and they sort of continued after the war too, after World War II. But some big changes happened after the war. In some of these clinical training programs for psychologists, the local psychoanalysts were willing to use brief autobiographical explorations with the student. That is, the graduate student who wished to get something of the feel of what it was like to be psychoanalyzed would take the role of a patient without expecting to continue in that role. Nevertheless, by engaging in some free associations under the direction of and interpretations of a psychoanalyst, some unexpected insight would emerge, and perhaps also some resistances against self-revelation, so that the student would have something other than a book knowledge of what psychoanalysis was about. One of the immediate evidences of the influence of this psychoanalytic thinking was the widespread use of projective tests in all clinical training programs. A popular topic for a PhD in clinical psychology in the 1950s was having the student use like a Rorschach inkblot test, or the thematic apperception test, which was these sort of drawings, and the person being evaluated would project a story onto the drawing. These interpretive methods of psychoanalysis were also used in connection with doll play, as introduced by Erik Erikson, a psychoanalyst who had studied in Europe with Anna Freud. The interpretation of doll play was also used by psychologists sympathetic to psychoanalysis, though they themselves might not have been psychoanalysts. So what I'm trying to show you here is that things that came out of psychoanalysis were sort of borrowed by other psychologists, clinical psychologists, who were not themselves psychoanalysts. So these various other aspects of psychoanalytic thinking became so commonplace in psychology that their psychoanalytic origins were soon forgotten, such as, like I've mentioned before, things like defense mechanisms, displacements, or difficulties in postponed gratification. So while it was quite popular just before, during, and after World War II, dissatisfaction with psychoanalysis grew during the 1960s. David Shakow had been trained by two psychoanalysts in the 1940s, and he had been an advocate of it since. But he had noted in 1969 the failure to support psychoanalytic claims by research. He urged that the psychoanalytic institutes offer training to behavioral and social scientists interested in research. Following the death of Freud, the reactions by his followers differed. Some felt that out of loyalty they should guard the essence of Freud's theories and practices against any change, which would lead to a fairly rigid orthodoxy among some of the training institutes. Others recognized that Freud was always modifying his views, and with his death, it was their obligation to advance psychoanalysis by making the changes that they felt necessary. One consequence was that several cities had more than one Freudian institute that would have quite different beliefs and practices, although each was represented in the American Psychoanalytic Association. The result was some unpleasant bickering and lots of parochialism, which was viewed with distaste by the scientific community. Now, there was a number of growing pains that were going on here in the 50s and 60s with clinical psychology, and some of these had to do with some turf issues. For example, one sort of problem arose between the clinical psychologists and the psychiatrists. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that there were these new drugs that were now available that were being used to treat, like, for instance, people with schizophrenia. And so the psychiatrists would have the ability to make the prescriptions for these kind of patients. And maybe if you were a psychoanalyst who had MD training, you could then also do some sort of talk therapy with the patient, whereas the clinical psychologist was left with not having the ability to prescribe medications and therefore had less power in these more medical places. Another kind of growing pain was that after World War II, there was such a need for clinical psychologists and counselors for all of the returning veterans who had been fighting in the war, that psychologists themselves needed to become more organized as a profession. They needed to be able to adopt standard practices for how one became trained as a clinical psychologist. And so a number of standards arose in the 40s and 50s after the war about how you should train a clinical psychologist and how psychologists would be trained differently, for instance, from a counseling psychologist. And that also led to, with this increased emphasis on training, led to debates about whether or not psychologists should be doing basic science and focusing on developing the field more and understanding more about psychology, or should they already be out there practicing and applying their knowledge from psychology in the laboratory to work with patients. So this was all sort of brewing after World War II. And as I said, this largely grew out of the fact that you had all of these people who had suffered from the war, both returning veterans and the public, who needed treatment, who needed to be seen by people. And so you got these clinics that popped up all over the place that had these teams of psychiatrists and psychologists. The governments in many countries backed the training of these people. They needed to train a lot of psychologists right away. And so, like I said, standardization of the methods of training became quite important. In the United States, one of the most important people in this regard was this David Shacko that I mentioned before. He developed what's known as the scientist-practitioner model. It's also sometimes called the Boulder model because it was first talked about at a conference in Boulder, Colorado. But it was basically a model for how postgraduate training for clinical psychologists should occur. And it was adopted by the American Psychological Association in 1949. And then every few years, they would tweak the program more and more and more. Keep in mind that he himself had spent a lot of time with psychoanalysts before the war, had worked in research on schizophrenia, and had been at a hospital where there was a team with psychologists and psychiatrists working together with their patients. So a lot of his expertise came out of just the kind of being right there in the trenches and seeing how psychologists could best help. And so his views on how people should be trained to be clinical psychologists became, like I said, not only adopted in the United States, but adopted around the world in lots of different clinical training programs. So his views on clinical psychology included a clinical psychologist should always be primarily a psychologist. So the point was that the basic identity of a clinical psychologist is that they come from the field of psychology and should know everything about the field of psychology. That psychology must be studied in the field and the laboratory. So this emphasized that clinical psychology should pay attention to all that laboratory research that's going on. Number 3, the preparation of the psychologist should always have a scientific background, although the psychologist may practice a professional skill afterward. So, for instance, in the United States, nearly all clinical psychologists have to have a PhD. This is not the case, for instance, in the United States, in the United Kingdom or in Australia or in Canada, but in the United States, they view this as a scientific degree. So you had to get the PhD to do a dissertation, a thesis that was scientific, and have that accompanied with your credentials to be able to professionally, to be a professional deliverer of services. That he said you should always be prepared with a viewpoint of the researcher and an evaluator of results. That the psychologist is humble and modest, making relatively few claims for his or her knowledge. This is suggesting that, yes, the psychology maybe isn't as developed as we would like to have it be, and so you should always be sort of humble and modest about what our knowledge is about it. That the psychologist is identified with the client, but in those rare instances where there's a conflict, they must take a social point of view. 7, the clinical psychologist and the experimental psychologist worked harmoniously toward a common overriding goal. And the aim of psychologists is to achieve the maturity to treat conflicts among disciplines or professions objectively. So these views all really were fed into the development of how clinical psychologists were supposed to be trained. They kind of state for you the basic assumptions of how postgraduate training in clinical psychology occurs. I'll go ahead and tell you just a little bit more about some other therapies, and I'll just say that I'm not going into great detail about any of these because I'm aware that most students get courses and other courses that cover a lot of these other kinds of therapies. So it's not really my point here to be comprehensive about it, but I just wanted to highlight a couple main sort of streams of where things went with therapy. One of these has to do with this person here, Carl Rogers. So I'll tell you a little bit about Carl Rogers and his client-centered therapy. Carl Rogers grew up on a farm in Wisconsin and had entered the University of Wisconsin as a student of agriculture. He was led through group discussion in the student YMCA to turn his major to history. He had a 6-month tour of China in 1922 with a group under the auspices of the World Student Christian Federation, and this liberalized his own religious views and led him to study at the Union Theological Seminary in New York, then representing real liberal Protestantism, as against his father's preference for him to go to Princeton Seminary, which was more conservative in its theology. He soon found it easy to move across the street to Teachers College of Columbia University, where he took some courses. He became involved in working with individuals and completed a doctorate in education in 1931 under Goodwin Watson on a test measuring the personality adjustment of children. He began working in New York at the Institute for Child Guidance. This was before he had completed his degree, and soon he found himself in a setting of Freudian thought that conflicted with his emphasis on measurement that he had learned at Teachers College. He then spent 12 years in child guidance at a child guidance clinic in Rochester, New York, where he became disenchanted with psychoanalysis, which was the dominant approach at that center. And so he gradually developed his own views. Rogers had a struggle because of the higher prestige given to MDs in the community, but by holding firm against the tradition, he ended in 1938. He ended 1938 as the first director of the Rochester Guidance Center. So that is, even though they usually were led by MDs, these guidance centers, he became the first psychologist to be a director of a guidance center there at Rochester. He then accepted a professorship in psychology at Ohio State University. This was his first regular academic appointment, and he spent the years 1940 to 44 there when he left to establish the Counseling Center at the University of Chicago. These years at Ohio State and Chicago gave him the opportunity to work with a large number of PhD candidates and to provide an evidential basis for his theorizing. His counseling center was very successful at Chicago, despite some friction between him and the psychiatry department, which was headed by a psychoanalyst, and milder conflicts with the psychology department, which was headed, unfortunately, by someone with a medical degree. When an offer came from the University of Wisconsin, his conflicts with psychiatrists at Rochester and Chicago may have emboldened him to ask that, despite his lack of medical training, he would like to be designated as a professor of psychiatry as well as psychology, and this wish was granted. His conflicts, though, with the psychology department led him to resign that appointment, but he remained a professor of psychiatry from the summer of 1957 to January 1964. The period at Wisconsin was full of turmoil, partly because of the problems with the Department of Psychology, partly because of difficulties with the large staff involving 200 persons over the time that he had attempted to apply client-centered therapy to patients with schizophrenia. It's quite possible that the methods were unsuitable for schizophrenic patients, but a full report that he had hoped to have in 1967 never actually appeared to explain that. The years beginning in 1964 were spent at the Western Behavioral Sciences Institute at La Jolla, California, and later he established his Center for the Studies of the Person, also at La Jolla. In these sort of freestanding settings in the 60s, he was able to spread his message widely in group therapy and in lecture and writing. He died in 1987. So what is client-centered therapy? Well, Rogers proposed this new method of dealing with the personal problems that his patients had shortly before World War II. He had this successful experience in child guidance in Rochester that had resulted in a book that brought him to the attention of academic psychologists in 1939. And so after he took that position at Ohio State, he stated his own position more fully in a highly influential book called Counselling and Psychotherapy in 1942. In it, he introduced his original form of counseling, which became a competitor to psychoanalytic psychotherapy. Although known first as non-directive counseling, it eventually became known as client-centered therapy. This therapy focused on change from the present rather than on causal factors from the past. Therapeutic sessions began without any history taking or psychological testing. As an optimistic view of human nature, this was really quite different from Freud's more pessimistic one. Freud's insight therapy was seen by Rogers as too intellectual, while he thought it was too much under the control of the therapist. So the primary difference was between him, the Freudians, was this ignoring of the past and turning to the future by Rogers. In essence, he thought that people were naturally good and able to solve their own problems once they came to accept the attitude that a person was a captain of his own ship and the master of his own destiny. His procedure was as verbal as psychoanalysis. The client, Rogers had had enough quarrels with the medical profession to avoid the word patient, and so that's why he called them clients. The idea was the client would just simply begin to talk, and the therapist, instead of interpreting, would listen carefully and clarify what the person was saying by repeating back the essence of what the person had just said. This acceptance of the client's feeling as entirely legitimate and valuable restored the client's self-image and self-confidence as the sessions continued. His research method included recording these interviews and then doing content analyses to note the changes in self-perceptions and plans as therapy proceeded. The therapist was never to criticize or give advice. The role was to befriend and clarify, and included both affect and intellect. He talked about unconditional positive regard and empathic understanding. There was little in the way of differential diagnosis or some sort of causal analysis. What counted was the moral outlook that the person had the ability to manage his or her own affairs if given the support and freedom to do so through perceiving the self as valuable, accepting self-perceived assets and liabilities, and taking the steps to fulfill his or her plans. What it had in common with psychoanalysis was its reliance on the self-perception of the person revealed in the words under the guidance of the therapist. In commenting on his success and his international following, Rogers expressed surprise that he ever achieved so much fame. He had the qualities of charismatic leader, but he denied any desire to impose himself on his followers, and he just succeeded in getting people to feel loyal to him without demanding it from them. So he had a huge impact on the way clinical psychology was conducted from that point on, and you can pick it up now if you actually go into training in clinical psychology or have taken a course in it, that many of his ideas are just now part of the way therapy is done. A very simple thing is, for instance, the way psychologists call their patients clients, and the way there's a lot of talk about unconditional positive regard, and a lot of therapists are taught about how to show empathic understanding. Okay, so that was client-centered therapy. And one more sort of line of approach here that I want to bring up and sort of finish today with is the behavioral approach. Okay, so this eventual turn away from the conventional approaches to psychotherapy happened in the 1950s and 60s. And a lot of this had to do with all of this dissatisfaction with psychoanalysis. And, this focus on intrapsychic problems and disturbances within the individual and so on. So it was all just sort of falling apart. Another thing that happened in the early 60s was a proposed change in the conception of what mental illness was. And a psychoanalytically trained psychiatrist named Thomas Szasz wrote this book in 1961 called The Myth of Mental Illness. And in it, he insisted that that seeing people of having mental problems was really actually just seeing people having a way of dealing with the problems of living. That is, he thought that it was inappropriate to talk about cures of people's mental illnesses because he thought the mental illness was actually a sort of sane response to a crazy world. And so instead what you should be doing is focusing on how to help that person cope better with the problems of living, whether these be biological, economic, political, or socio-psychological, he said. So in England, R.D. Laing, a leader over there, also had a closely related position. But a third influence that really led to big changes in the way clinical psychology was done from that point was the development of behavior modification. The leaders in this new treatment of behavior disorders spoke with the voices of committed behaviorists who wished to rule out all of those intrapsychic factors from psychology just generally. They wanted to just focus on behavior. And so they were able to get some early success in the outcomes of their treatments. And they were basically able to show they were more effective than psychoanalysis and all its derivatives. The two most probably important leaders here were Joseph Wolpe, who had come to America from South America, where he had derived his approach from his conditioning work with cats and had become an ardent supporter of Pavlovian conditioning to be applied to human problems. And the second person was our guy from last week, that was B.F. Skinner, whose behaviorism was well known. A third person who's also important to all this was Albert Bandura. And Albert Bandura showed in his research how important modeling was and how a lot of our behaviors could be picked up from just simply from watching somebody else, so that we didn't have to actually be reinforced ourselves for a particular behavior for it to become a behavior that might cause us a lot of difficulty. We could have simply learned from observing others, and watching them might teach us to engage in some of these bad behaviors ourselves, these unhelpful, hurtful behaviors. So these three people, Wolpe, Skinner, and Bandura, really led this fight away from this whole intrapsychic disease as a model for mental illness. And then the other thing that happened was you get cognitive psychology coming along, and it brought up some new interesting things in the early 70s where cognitive factors were talked about. That is, maybe beliefs that are repetitive or beliefs that cause some sort of harm to the individual could be brought into the whole model and the whole approach of clinical psychology. So all of this just shows you a little bit about how all this worked. And again, I could go into much more detail than this, but I'm going to leave it to other psychology courses that you take to better introduce you to the different kinds of therapies that are out there. So that's all I have for this lecture, and I will see you next time.